Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 15th of July. I apologize for my 1 week hiatus. I had a lot of exams. Tomorrow is my final one, and then we're getting straight into business. We're looking today at many updates, especially northeast of Pokrovsk. A lot of the projections that I've been talking about for the past 2 months are now coming into fruition with a deep Russian breakthrough approaching a really important road that acts as a lifeline between Dobropilya and Pokrovsk. So we're going to look at that update first and foremost, but we actually have a lot of advances throughout the entirety of the front line. And probably tomorrow, I'll discuss the political situation between the EU, Donald Trump, Ukraine, and Russia. So that will be left for tomorrow. But today, I want to look at the tactical situation. So let's zoom in over here and first and foremost, look at the polygons indicating advances over the past 8 days in yellow. You can see the Russian forces have been able to close this salient that had existed in a gray zone marked between Razine, Kopjeve, Shevchenko Pershe, Malanivka, and Mirny. It amounts to 8.6 square kilometers of territory. Essentially, there was no means by which the Ukrainians could continue their resistance over here because they were so close to getting cut off. There were several prongs of Russian advances, including this one over here that you can see that allowed the Russians to advance through several settlements and eventually arrive at Razine, which is the village that acted as the crossing point between either side of the Kazeni Toretsk River over here. So once the Russians anchored themselves at that populated area, they had a forward base of operations to push southwards and put a lot of pressure on the rear of this rather large salient, which again is problematic because it's an area that's not well defended. It's completely open. It's a high elevation, of course, that doesn't really have much of an impact when the soldiers that are utilizing those higher elevated areas are all hiding. They're hiding in tree lines or in trenches, so they're not actually using it for any sort of reconnaissance or firing. They're just trying to evade detection by the Russian side. And so they had no other option but to withdraw towards Novoekonomichny to the southwest. And from there, we're already seeing a mass withdrawal of the Ukrainian small squads as they are forced to coalesce around the second perimeter line because we've already seen the Russians breach the first one. It's not a complete line, but you can see already how these trenches have been taken over by the Russian side. So you already have this layer that's directly west of the Toretsk River that has also been taken over due to continuous pushes by Russian assault forces. And you can see how this layer that acts as a ring around Murnohrad is also now coming under immense pressure, not directly east of Murnohrad, but actually further north. And that's concerning because it means the Russians have a really palpable route to arrive at Rodinske. So we'll look at that in a second. But just to reiterate, the Ukrainians are trying to rely on salients east of this chain of villages, including Novoekonomichny and including the Toretsk River, in order to distract Russian forces, pin them down, make it more difficult for them to maneuver with their logistics to approach the front line. But we're in the final stages of a lot of these outstretched salients that also consist of a massive amount of surface area, either under Ukrainian control or in a gray zone. So here you have it, the one that is basically just east of Mykolaiivka, north of Myrylyubivka. It's in the process of falling into Russian hands. There's really no realistic means for the Ukrainians to continue resisting over here. You can see that it extends about 6.3 kilometers southeastwards. It's extremely deep and it's actually very narrow when it comes to the escape route that the Ukrainians have available to them. So now the Russians are in the process of closing that, which will give a lot more flexibility for the Russian forces that are now building up and accumulating in Myrylyubivka, as that will be used as one of the forward operating points to then exert even more pressure on Novoekonomichny, which is also in a sort of salient right now. Because you can see that from the north, there's a lot of pressure. From the east, the Russians have captured the entirety of Mirny. You can see that over here with this video from July 13th of the 91st Anti-Tank Battalion conducting shelling with D-30 howitzers, firing towards Russian forces as they were entering into the warehouses. So there was a clear route to arrive at this village as well from the east, along with the breakthroughs that we talked about earlier on in the month that occurred in Mykolaiivka. So from all directions except the western one, this village is coming under immense pressure. And then you would have a new correction of the front line and the Ukrainians would have no choice but to put all of their efforts into defending this next line, which is obviously well built in the sense that there are anti-tank ditches and trenches mapped out in yellow. You can see them. I highlighted them. And you could also see that further westwards, that's already the entrance into Mirnorod. And the Ukrainians would prefer that the fighting does not actually really arrive into the actual urban cluster. They would prefer that it gets relegated elsewhere, because once it becomes an urban slog, it's either the Ukrainians would have to leave as a result, but they would prefer to have lower attrition rates and keep the fighting in smaller villages where there's less of a need for a large amount of infantry. It's not even possible to court a large amount of men to fight in certain areas. And so drone crews are much more favored in those scenarios, wherein the Russian forces are trotting through large swaths of open fields. And of course, they're not always caught, but at the very least, the Ukrainians don't suffer high casualties during those sort of breakthroughs. And there's also a chance to inflict casualties on the Russians while they're advancing. So that the Ukrainians prefer that dynamic as opposed to the Russians actually being able to enter into the urban area. And the worst case scenario would be the Russians squeezing them out of the urban area by cutting off their access routes from the north. And we're seeing that maneuver unfold right now, right before our very eyes. We can see that the Russian forces have captured, combined with these two polygons, 5.2 square kilometers and 11.5 square kilometers, 16.7 square kilometers of territory taken over in total. This includes a full capture of Razine, partial capture of Fedorivka, and an entrance into the village of Novotoretsk, right next to Boykivka. So let's dissect what happened here. So we have a couple of geolocations. First one is from the 2nd Self-Propelled Battalion. This is an artillery unit from the 16th National Guard Brigade. This artillery unit that's become very prominent over here as they're trying to alleviate some of the pressure caused by Russian defensive actions as they're entering into houses and leaving basements. Here you can see the 16th Brigade, and I think their 2nd Battalion is marked somewhere over here on the map. It's not that important, but just know they exist, and I've been uploading a lot of videos on Facebook recently. So they're shelling right next to Novokonomichny due to the Russian advance from Razine further southwards. And then we have two other videos. First one encapsulates the deep Russian breakthrough that amounted to 4.3 kilometers. So it's not about the actual distance that was achieved or was accrued, because we've seen more extreme examples of just in a single moment Russian forces being able to pass through the Ukrainian line of contact and achieve deep penetrations. In this case, it is a relatively deep penetration, but it's through a dense area that should be on paper well defended, because you have the western bank of the river, which includes Razina, and these layers of trenches that actually do have a sophisticated formation in the sense that, there are zigzags, there are underground components, there are bunkers, there are um, also these mines in between the trenches and barbed wire before you enter in. So there's a lot of intricacies, not to all of these trenches, but to some of them in this area, and not just over here, but also around Yablonka, which we'll get to. But it's not that much of a game changer if there aren't men that are actually able to man those trenches near the front line. And it's not necessarily a crisis of manpower for the Ukrainians over here, because they do have a notable garrison. We can go through it very quickly. There are units over here that are very active on the front line, like the 38th Marine Brigade, 91st Anti-Tank Battalion, Scala Assault Regiment. You have the 17th Heavy Mechanized Brigade. The list goes on. There are a lot of units over here. I don't think it's enough, by the way. I don't think the caliber is high enough. I don't think that specifically in the area that spans from Fedorivka to Myrylyubivka, this 11-kilometer span of territory, I don't think there was a sufficient amount of troops. I think a lot of them are in the general sector, but maybe they're not deployed to this particular hotspot. They're deployed a bit further northeastwards to Yablonka or a bit further southwards to Pokrovsk. So there has to be a sort of recalibration of Ukraine's priorities. And I'm sure they're in the process of conducting those sort of rotations and moving more in, because that's why we're seeing the National Guard artillery units compensating so much now. But definitely there has to be an increase in the amount of mechanized brigades operating over here, not just territorial or National Guard units, not just FPV crews, actual on the ground individuals that can be involved in defending in trenches, because there are a whole host of trenches that can be used to bog down the Russian advance, in addition to populated areas. So that has to be kept in mind. But it's not just about the manpower, it's also about the considerations, because with some of these rapid advances, they really did neuter any sort of potential for Ukrainians to even utilize the trenches if they so chose, because they're not going to stay in those trenches 24/7 right on ground zero of the front line in a lot of cases, because that could be extremely dangerous. So the vast majority of Ukrainian forces that are involved in daily fighting are stationed in Myrhorod or in Rodinske, and then from there they could get deployed to frontline sectors. But due to the really rapid pace of the advance that occurred, and this was on July 14th, the Ukrainians didn't even have a chance to respond to it in time. So this has given the Russian forces a lot of leeway to expand deeper into the Ukrainian rear in this area, take over a lot of defensive areas that, had the Ukrainians successfully managed to deploy forces over there, could have been a problem and could have dragged out fighting. And now a lot of that has been taken out of the equation. And so already looking at the next layer of Ukrainian defenses, and the Russians continue peeling back at the intricacies of Ukraine's defense over here. So as we can see, the Russian forces, they were spotted on foot in many cases. So this isn't even happening with vehicles in a lot of cases, which is incredible. The fact that the Russian forces can by foot cross over the river, cross through exposed areas, and arrive right next to key populated areas like Chervony Liman. Now, obviously, in this case, they were struck, so that's a positive, but they should have been struck from a Ukrainian point of view as they were approaching the Shevchenko Perishe Razina area. Now, it's possible that the Russians have this mechanism by which they are using armored vehicles or even just private vehicles to transport forces to the Toretsk River, and then from there, the forces go on foot. And what we can see over here is that from July 14th, this video is from the Argus Reconnaissance Company. They conducted FPV strikes on Russian infantry as they were passing by these forested areas near the sludge ponds. This area is really dense in industrial sectors, in industrial facilities, in warehouses. You can see over here one of those mines in an adjacent slag heap. I didn't have time to get into the specific names for all of them, but they are all sort of associated with the Myrhorod industrial complex. You could also see over here another one of these massive terracons that is now right next to Russian boundaries. So they can take it over, and they would have a perfect field of vision to fire into Myrhorod. At the very least, it would put the Russians on parity elevation-wise, something that they've been unable to do because they were never this close to the city. Now they are, and now they're actually beginning to take over key assets, areas that are at least on par, if not even higher up. And that can prove a problem because it gives them domination, not just in the city itself, but also with the road leading into it. So this is the infamous road that I've been talking about. It passes right next to Rodinske, and Rodinske is just the obvious goal that I've been talking about for so long. We mentioned even 2 months ago that the Russian forces were keen on approaching Razinet, using that as an outlet for breakthroughs, and then from there reaching Rodinske, and by extension cutting off the road from Dobropilya, which acts as the sort of backup base for the Ukrainians in this part of Donetsk, the area that sort of acts as a conduit between Dnipro and Donetsk. So Dobropilya, far less pressure on it right now, even though there's an uptick in shelling on it, there was an uptick in FAB strikes. All that's of course true. There's also even FPV strikes targeting the city, even though it's pretty far away from the front line at this point. What is it, like 16 kilometers away? But yeah, it's within the field of a lot of fire by the Russians recently. Either way, they are using it as a conduit point to move in reinforcements and beef up the defenses in this cluster of cities. So now that the Russians have an opportunity to cut off the road, that's going to really, in the long term, play a big role in diminishing Ukraine's defensive capabilities. So look at it. The earlier Russian effort at cutting off logistics in Pokrovsk was from the west. And at their zenith, like the Russian zenith of attacks, they were only about 5 kilometers away from reaching the road. Now we're at a point where the Russians are only about 4.7 kilometers away. And what's separating them is this village, Chervony Liman, defended by the 38th Marine Brigade, and Rodinske, which is a moderately large town, so it's not going to be easy to overrun it. But the Russians have done a large amount of the work that was needed, because at the beginning, before the Russians had secured many of these breakthroughs, the front line was sort of based around the T-0504 highway. It was even further south of it. The Russian forces took advantage of a huge hole in the Ukrainian line, which we repeatedly mentioned, and called upon for Ukrainian forces to really try to hold back upon and send in the reinforcements. And the thing is, the Ukrainians did send in reinforcements in many cases, but a lot of them were focused on sort of keeping the Russians at bay from expanding further northwards or expanding towards Yablonivka, because they were concerned about Konstantinivka being next on the menu, or they were concerned about, say, Volodymyrivka coming under Russian attacks or purview. But this area was always more peripheral to Russia's objectives in the Donetsk axis. Obviously, it's going to play a role in the future, this axis of attack coming in further north. You can see the arrows pointing towards this large network of open fields that is just adjacent to these villages that include Toretsk over here, because this would give the Russians a lot of leeway to push and flank further eastwards to Konstantinivka or further westwards to Dobropilia and put a lot of pressure on their logistics. So yeah, that's obviously a Russian consideration. It's one of their long-term considerations going into the end of 2025, 2026 period, looking at those two cities. But at this very moment in time, it was very clear that the Russians were using this maneuver as a means by which to break through the really strong, on paper at least, defensive network that was surrounding Pokrovsk and Munirod. And now they succeeded at doing so. Now it's just a matter of arriving at the immediate outskirts of those cities. So, as we can see, Rodinske is a target, Fedorivka is a target, because then from there they can expand to other nearby villages like Zatishok and Nyan-Korivka, Boykivka, and from there they just expand the footprint that runs along the highway and make it even more difficult to utilize. From a Ukrainian point of view, it deepens the penetration from the rear and gives the Russians a solid base to then begin pushing southwards and begin actually clearing out urban clusters if need be. But at the same time, you're also seeing the Russians push a bit further northwards to Toretsk, and here you have an advance of, what is that, 1 square kilometer. This is from the 120th Reconnaissance Regiment. They just conducted FPV strikes east of Novotoretsk in this case, indicating a small advance. Another area of the front line that's recently heated up is Yablonivka. We did discuss how the Ukrainians were able to conduct localized counterattacks that succeeded in, first of all, putting the Russians on the back foot, which was, it's part of the Ukrainian playbook with a lot of their defensive activities. It's what they did in Pokrovsk initially and were able to subside the Russian attacks. Those really, they should focus afterwards to the eastern flank, as we looked at a second ago. But over here in Yablonivka, the situation was always unfavorable to the Ukrainians, and it was always a matter of time before the Russians closed in, because Yablonivka itself is just so detached from other Ukrainian garrisons over here, with Konstantinivka being far away and the road between the front lines in the city being relatively open, and it then becomes a sort of ground for Russian FPVs to strike incoming vehicles. And also, Yablonivka was in a really difficult crescent shape, defending all across the sort of frontal area, and then the flanks is just extremely difficult for small Ukrainian garrisons to hold on in such scenarios, in such conditions. So it was always going to be difficult for the Ukrainians to hold on during the initial Russian push, but they were able to keep their ground, hold on to the eastern sections of Yablonivka and Alexandru Kalinove. But now the Russians have renewed their efforts and reversed all of the Ukrainian gains accrued during their counterattacks, and have gained even more. And now they're very close to taking over the entirety of the settlement, which will be a massive victory, because it will then act as a forward garrison, a forward operating base to latch on to the T-0504 highway, and to this highway that passes through Romanivka, and then actually arrive at the southwestern outskirts of Konstantinivka. There would be no major barrier separating them besides the trenches. So you can see over here an advance of 4.3 square kilometers. The Russians capture that territory. You can see there are a couple of videos that back this up. These were from the initial Ukrainian counterattacks at the beginning of the month, and this is from July 14th. 33rd Motor Rifle Regiment of the 20th Division, their armored vehicle pushed through the main road and was filmed, able to push, as we can see over here, 2 kilometers in that direction. So now you can see how the plan is to just sort of squeeze out the Ukrainian remnants that are largely from the 36th Marine Brigade, some of them from the 127th Battalion, from the 109th TDF Brigade, some from Separate Presidential Brigade, at least one of its battalions. So keep that in mind. Keep an eye out for the full capture of that settlement. Also, we have the Russians over here capturing 9.35 square kilometers of territory just east of Popiev Yar and north of the highway. This is once again that area that I discussed. It's sort of a wedge location, really open, not well defended from a Ukrainian standpoint. And that's in regards to actual obstacles. There is a large deployment of Ukrainian forces from what is this, 111th TDF Brigade, 80th Air Assault Brigade, or 82nd rather. Here you have 157th Mechanized Brigade, 117th Heavy Mechanized Brigade. So there is a strong deployment over here, and it's because they don't want the Russians to take advantage of the heights over here, which would give them complete domination of either side of the chains of villages that then connect in Druskivka, which is another one of the long-term Russian objectives over here because of how it feeds into the frontline cities. So that's, again, another calculation made by the Ukrainian side. But in the meantime, they can't defend every single swath of open territory. So a lot of that is being seized by the Russian side at this point. And we have this video from July 14th of the Vartovy drone unit from the 36th Marine Brigade conducting FPV strikes on Russian soldiers and on a tank as they were entering into the trench network built by the Ukrainians over here. So this is another sort of associated part of the Yablonka operation. It's not just about taking over Yablonka, it's about taking over the trenches north of it because they are well built, as I said before, very similar in style to the Pokrovsk trenches. So with a proper amount of manpower that could actually be fed consistently from the rear without having their logistics cut off or harassed, it actually is a solid area for defense. The problem is that just a lot of the areas that are near this trench network are just completely open, so it's very difficult to receive, consistent supports from the rear when it's actually necessary. So now you're beginning to see the Russians chip away at this layer of defense, and the crown jewel will be taking over Poltavka and then also Rusin Yar. Then the Russians would really have an open season to shift focus wherever they so choose. It could be directly north, it could be northeastwards to Konstantinivka, and then they could just overrun this chain of villages over here. It could also be further westwards to sort of deal with the Volodymyrivka axis. All of that would be on the menu for them, and that's why it's so important for the Ukrainians to deny them access to such a possibility. And just to circle back to Yablonivka, you can see the same sort of chipping away at trenches over here with a capture of 0.7 square kilometers of territory just north of the locality. And you can see how these dense defenses are being taken over, cleared out. So that process is definitely not complete. When we look at the Toretsk front or the area just west of it, the Russian forces have been able to clear out the entirety of the Zabalka district after a lot of back and forth fighting. So that amounts to 22 hectares of territory. Here in Novospassky, 1.2 square kilometers of territory captured. But this is a very important advance if it can be held up. So we'll have to see what is reported on and elaborated upon by both sides surrounding the breakthrough into the center of Novospassky, because right now the corridor through which the Ukrainians can leave Shcherbinivka is extremely limited. So it is possible that they just sort of accept their fate and move out and just give up on their forward operating base over here, even though it's been extremely useful for them to be anchored in Shcherbinivka and Novospassky, because from there they can just use it as a linchpin to attack towards Toretsk, which acts as a major organization and logistics hub for the Russians. So a lot of the Russian plans going forward to Konstantinivka have been stymied due to the consistent Ukrainian ability to hold on over here. Now that's beginning to change, as you can see, and it's been a huge Russian priority. So they've captured this chunk of territory Let's see how much they advanced in a vertical direction. It amounts to around 1.75 kilometers northwards. And you can see the video of the Russian flag being raised in Novospassky, the 2nd Battalion of the 1465th Motor Rifle Regiment that entered into the village yesterday. That was so they stormed it in that scenario, and this does create a lot of friction with Shoshobenivka, as we reiterated. And it's not the first time there's been a breakthrough, but at this point, this deep into the battle for these villages, the situation has changed remarkably because now the Ukrainians have less surface area to defend in Shoshobenivka, so they're closed in. They also don't have a lot of breathing space to the north because the Russians have taken over every single field, all the houses that are basically adjacent to the railroad that runs further southwards into New York. So their options are very limited over here. The only option that will be successful in sort of pushing back, kicking the can down the road with the viability of defense over here will be a head-on Ukrainian committal to counterattack onto the salient that was captured by the Russians. So we'll see whether the Russians are able to close out this village, and from there they would have a lot more security in Toretsk, and you would expect to see the pace of Russian advances towards Katerinivka and Klebanbek in this entire Kryvyi Toretsk River area begin to accelerate. And this is all happening in tandem with a lot of deep Russian advances chipping away at dugouts and open areas that are just to the north of Toretsk. So you can see over here 2.9 square kilometers of territory taken over by the Russians. This video is from the 3rd Battalion of the 28th Mechanized Brigade. Their FPVs targeted 2 tanks near the Dolivka railway station over here. So they have been able to continue penetrating the Ukrainian line. This area is dangerous in the sense that you don't see that many ground-to-ground engagements because really you have a large degree of separation between either side. They're not fighting over individual houses anymore because Dolivka has been taken over by the Russian side. So now it's just fighting over plots of land, it's fighting over large spans of road and tree lines. So FPV crews are very active around here. So the Ukrainian forces that are actually operating in this region, they're sort of fighting out of Bilohora and Alexandro Shultine. And you're beginning to see how the front line with Chasiv Yar is beginning to connect with the one that's just west of the Donbass Canal. The Ukrainian holdings that have been so critical in preventing deep Russian advances towards Konstantinivka, they're beginning to be taken over. And having the Ukrainians anchored for what has it been now, like 3 years along the canal, it provided them with a lot of security. It really ensured that they had a lot of breathing space 20 kilometers westwards to build up. But now you're seeing, mainly from the south, the efforts of the Russians to chip away at all these holdings that have been built up for at least 3 years, but in many cases even more, along this canal line, and how it's connecting with the advances from the north, from Sopochki, from Chasiv Yar in general. And so the Ukrainian holdings over here, they're not sustainable. They're not anchored around many large settlements. There aren't that many trenches that are of notable size. There are a lot of individual dugouts, to be fair, but the connectivity, the routes to enter into this area are becoming more and more hazardous. So you could see the move that the Russians are going for in this particular area. That includes advancing northeast of the Lvivka, taking over 2.1 square kilometers of territory. You can see how this salient is becoming untenable, and it just acts as a means of putting pressure on Kordyomivka because that's another organization point for the Russians. Although once this pocket closes, I don't think it will even have that sort of frontline primacy. The Lvivka will begin to have that because it is a pretty large populated area, which can be used to extend outwards towards other interfluves and other ravines and valleys in the area. And then from there, you can see populated areas being taken over that have access to key roads that enter into Konstantinivka from the southeast. So all of the infrastructure, all of the sort of groundwork is being laid for this eventual attack to isolate the city of Konstantinivka from multiple axes. So obviously keep an eye out for that in the near future. Also, let's look at other sections of the front line. We have a lot of advances, surprisingly, on the Donetsk, Kharkiv, Luhansk sort of trial blast border region. So you can see the capture of Zelandolina has been completed. The Russians took it over on July 11th. This was an effort of the 1428th Motorized Rifle Regiment. They captured in total 21.7 square kilometers of territory. That is a significant amount. It includes this hamlet called Lipove, A lot of open areas over here simply are difficult for the Ukrainians to defend. They don't have a massive manpower commitment over here. So even small Russian assault groupings are able to just seep in, advance rather deep without being spotted due to the dense forestry in this area. And they're able to then assert themselves in a certain location and sort of build off of that. That's what we're seeing with these deep penetrations over here that amount to 7.2 kilometers westwards. So the Russians now, their next objective, because they are beginning to solidify control over these major gains, will be to cut off Chandri Holove. That's, I think, a pretty clear goal right now. And the way to do that is to first cut off the network of villages to its north. That includes Kharkivka, which is very close to the front line, and includes Serezhnia and everything in between. Then Chandri Holove will be sort of left on its own, and it is concerning because from there, the Russian forces have control over a massive network of roads that. And the thing is, this area in Donetsk that's very close to the Oskil River, it's lacking in quality paved roads. This area is already very difficult when it comes to the vicissitudes and elevation and how close it is to rivers, multiple rivers, even the Seversky Donetsk River. So, there's all the conditions that cause the quality of the existing roads to be poorer. And there's also been 3 years of neglect on these roads. Obviously, nobody's doing road work at this time. But even before the war, there weren't that many roads built over here. So, whatever side is defending, they're relying on a very certain specific network that's all connected together. So once you sort of take out the crown jewel, everything comes falling down with it. So that's what we saw initially with the capture of Nove, which gave the Russians that initial access to the road network. And now we're seeing that again with the potential advance towards Chandri Holove, which will then be utilized to advance southwards and begin putting pressure to take over Drobysheve and Liman. That's long term, obviously, but the plan is already in place. That's the move that we're seeing over here, and the Russians have found a weak point to exploit in order to achieve those objectives. We're also seeing advances to close in on this major pocket that, again, it's not something that's happening instantaneously. This is building up and will continue to do so for months, honestly. You can see over here this salient in the Ukrainian line that acts as a distraction. It sort of pins down Russian forces that could have else, in any other case, focused directly on approaching the Oskil River, approaching Borova, approaching the two lines of defenses that are surrounding Borova. Instead, they are focusing on these open areas in the chain of villages from Novosibirsk to Olhivka. You can see over here the Russians captured 1.7 square kilometers on the border between the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. You can see that this video is a bit old, but there is this new video east of Kharkivka from the 252nd Motor Rifle Regiment, wherein they had two motorcyclists advancing through open areas, through forested regions, and they were able to push 1.4 kilometers northwards. We also have a couple of advances on the Kharkiv fronts, which we'll get to. Russian forces have been able to enter into Rodkivka, capturing 40 hectares of territory. That's a small amount in the grand scheme of things, but it does further deepen the salient that is sort of centered in between Kindrashivka and Holubivka. So once that closes with this Russian pressure, if it's able to further accumulate, then the Russians would have all of the bases needed to launch an attack on the western side of Kupiansk, which would obviously have a lot of implications for all of the garrisons built east of the Oskil River and for their logistics situation. Over here, you have an advance amounting to, what is that, nearly 9 square kilometers of territory. It's just to the west of Kamyanka, but a lot of these open areas, they are not well defended. The Ukrainians lack any sort of obstacle that they can use to anchor themselves to the land over here. So it's only the FPV crews, and they only can do so much. So at this point, the Russians are able to take advantage and seize a lot of open areas. The 3rd Tank Brigade, their FPVs killed a Russian squad north of Krasnopersia, but either way, the advance itself was able to push deeper and get closer to areas like Kolodiazne and Vorichanske. At the same time, we have further Russian advances from Miloved. They were able to, as I said before, find a weak point in the Ukrainian line along the border that's obviously pretty deep into this, non tense part of the front lines area that's really not been involved in a lot of the ground skirmishes over the past 3 years, but it's still connected on a lower level to the front line on the Oskil River. So there could be a unification at some point. At the same time, though, there is a lot of potential for this salient to continue expanding if reinforcements are not sent towards Veliki Burluk. That would be like the overarching objective of all this. But for the time being, we're looking at smaller advances. This one amounting to 2.84 kilometers, and the advance pushing about 2 kilometers southwestwards. A tank and BTR 40 from they were destroyed. Russian tank and BTR 40 in this case. The 3rd Tank Brigade, they attacked them as they were sort of moving through the tree lines, sifting through these large swaths of open fields and forested areas. And now the sort of bases have been set up to begin attacks towards Ambarny and Khatnya. So we'll see if that actually does materialize. Looking at Sumy, I don't want to focus too much on this area, lest the video past like 45 minutes. I'm going to try to keep it at a minimum. But it has to be said that the Ukrainians have been able to not only stop the Russian advances, but actually reverse them. And that's extremely positive. I'm going to try to steelman a positive case for the Ukrainian side. But obviously, this isn't what I think will play out. But from a Ukrainian perspective, they do have a sizable garrison over here. I've previously estimated that's around 30,000, maybe 25,000, but it's definitely in that uh, sort of ballpark when it comes to the amount of brigades that are on paper mentioned around here and not mentioned anywhere else. And then, the presumed size of the brigade and their sort of specific battalions that are placed along the front line. So you do have a lot of high caliber units over here. That's obviously not up for discussion. Just look at the caliber. You have ranger units, you have certain elements of the air assault brigades, you have specialized assault units like the 225th Assault Regiment, you have tank brigades, the list goes on. So they were able to launch 2 attacks, one of them on Andriivka, which had already sort of been in a back and forth with the Russians, unable to exploit their advances south of Andriivka. The Ukrainians took advantage of that resting period, that operational pause that the Russians had because they were so exhausted after closing the Kursk pocket and then pushing deep into Sumy. So now the reversal is beginning with the Ukrainians having this positional advance, taking over 1 square kilometer of territory and taking over most of the village of Andriivka. And as a result, the Russians conducted airstrikes. This is on July 8th. They conducted heavy airstrikes trying to suppress the Ukrainian advances in order to prevent them from using that as momentum to advance even deeper towards an area like Oleksivka. Also in Kindrativka, this is really important. 4 square kilometers of territory taken over by the Ukrainian side. And this video from July 8th as well, shows further Russian airstrikes on the northeastern parts of the village, indicating that the majority of it has fallen into Ukrainian hands. There may be a small salient in the southern chunk of the village that remains under Russian control, but it is not solid enough. It's not a strong or wide enough base to actually be used to have any sort of offensive threat. So the Russians have to actually coordinate an attack from Konstantinivka and from the border with Kursk in order to retake this territory. But for now, we haven't actually seen much of a Russian offensive effort in this section of the front line. We actually are seeing some movement around Yunikivka, so that's a major Russian objective right now. But the Ukrainians have been able to chip away at these 2 villages, while the Russians are not necessarily responding in kind with ground maneuvers. They are, though, committing a lot of their aerial assets to this region. So the Ukrainian hope would be to sort of connect between the 2 advances in order to remove any sort of frontline Russian presence in the salient that is based out of some houses and a couple of lower lying ravines. With that out of the way, the correction in the front line would alleviate a lot of pressure that I was mentioning that was starting to form around the second line of villages running from Mykolaievka all the way to Kyansia. This line is extremely important. It's about, like 5.5 kilometers away from the front line, and it acts as a unified base for Ukrainian rear, for the Ukrainian defenses, where a lot of the troops are stationed on a day-to-day basis. And once that falls, you do have a huge glaring hole in the line before you arrive at the city of Sumy itself and its associated suburbs. So that's why it's of the utmost importance that the Ukrainians ensure the fighting is sort of relegated to the first line of villages, to the border regions, and doesn't actually reach deep enough to threaten these villages like Pisarivka. And that's why they're conducting attacks on the front foot. That's why they're willing to expend that capability. And obviously, if there's any area along the front line that the Ukrainians would conduct a counterattack, it would be over here because we've seen them do it before. We saw them launch the offensive in the first place with very similar composition of forces. We saw them launch adjacent attacks on the Tetkino recently. We saw them attack in Belgorod. So obviously they're going to obviously take advantage of gaps in the Russian line caused by excessive advances to try to reverse some of it. And it would culminate and would be actually really successful if they were able to take over Oleksivka and close in on it. Because then from there would be no major base, no major sort of frontline position for the Russians to use to advance along the highway to arrive at the nearby villages on line number 2. So that would alleviate a lot of pressure. And then from there, the focus would sort of be relegated to Volodymyrivka, Volodymyr, and there would be no way to sort of unify between the two Russian components of the Sumy offensive. The smaller one over here, which is already being targeted because it is weaker, because it is more exposed, and then the one over here that is currently focused on Unikivka. And speaking of which, the Russian forces continue making inroads in Unikivka. It is a relatively large populated area. This advance amounts to zero point 0.8 square kilometers of territory, though. It's from July 14th. It's of the 156th Brigade conducting FPV strikes onto the infantry that are located over here in Unikivka. I have no idea why I said Yablonivka. I guess I mixed up the names. But in any case, this shows that the fighting is now centered around the southern parts of this village. And the loss of the village would be significant because then you have an open area spanning about, 5.3 kilometers before you arrive at the national parks, the really dense forested areas. And then from there, you have a potential to sort of flank the line number 2 from the east. So it's possible the Russians now, they've accepted that the situation is difficult and that, it would require a lot of resources to sort of reverse what the Ukrainians have already achieved over here. I don't think that it's out of the question that they do try to reverse it in the near future. But at the same time, they're trying to push through Nikivka, and then from there, we'll see if they actually use that to open up a new route of attacks that can also put a lot of strain on the Ukrainians in Sumy Oblast, but from a new direction. So we'll have to keep an eye out and see if that actually does develop. Okay, so let's finish off just by zooming in on a couple of more peripheral updates from the Southern Donetsk and Zaporizhzhia fronts. I save them for last because they were a bit less important in my view. So let's zoom in over here. You can see that just to the east of the Donetsk and Dnipro border, 3.65 square kilometers of territory taken over. This includes some trenches that are north of Oleksivka. So once again, the salient is being chipped away at. A lot of massive advances occurred in southern Donetsk. You could see that the Russians captured Hrushivske, Tolstoy, Novokhatske. This video over here is from the 36th Motor Rifle Brigade. They captured Tolstoy. Russian sources claim a company's worth of men from the 37th Marine Brigade, which is one of the key units involved in Ukraine's defense over here, were lost, quote unquote, lost during the fighting over here. Companies between 100 to 250 men, so that's their claim for the killed and wounded. Again, it's a very small size. This is a very small hamlet, I should say. And you could also see that Novokhatska was taken over. The Sicario FEV unit conducted strikes onto Russian soldiers at the northern tip of the village, meaning they already have the opportunity to expand westwards and build upon their momentum to take over Zeleny High. So we'll look at that possibility. You also have the highway over here. It's now an opportune time for the Russians to expand through open fields that are largely undefended because there are not many trenches over here. There are a lot of units deployed to this area on paper, but the majority of their forces are deployed on the other side of the river near Havrylivka or in Ivanivka. So the response to movement through swaths of open fields will be limited, and it's simply not feasible in the current environment of fighting over here. So you're going to see troops on foot or on motorcycles advance towards Andrivka Klevtsove, which is already under intense Russian bombardment. And that will be the sort of opening pathway to cross over the river at some points. But for now, you're looking at 12 square kilometers of territory captured. And southwards, you have the capture of Perabudova and Mirny. This is from July 13th. The Russians captured Mirny. 400 houses were cleared. The 141st Mechanized Brigade was pushed out. You can see them over here. One of the key units involved in defending. And as a result of other advances that occurred towards Voskresenka, this salient is formed. This salient that you could see marked in blue and with the red perimeter, This is one of those outstretched pockets where the Ukrainians are not willing to let go of forward positions near the Mokrali River just yet. It's one of the final areas of the front line that they actually have like sort of immediate access to the river in. And soon that will be sort of dissipating because there's a lot of pressure coming in from the north and south. And this area is once again not well defended from a sort of physical obstacle point of view. It's an area that's on high elevation, but that's going to be seized by the Russians now, just like the high elevation that's located east or rather west of Vasily has fallen into Russian hands. So when it comes to Voskresenka, you could see that the Russians captured nearly 13 square kilometers of territory. There's this video here from July 9th of the 31st Mechanized Brigade's FPV strikes on to numerous villages that were acting as coordination points between the Russian side. So that includes strikes on Kamar, Fedorivka, and Vasily, but it also includes strikes that were very close to Voskresenka. What do you think about it? Because it is a village that is directly on the border with Dnipro and Donetsk, and it is several kilometers to the west of the sort of normally agreed upon front line. So this area clearly has a gap. Clearly, the Ukrainians, even though they have so many forces deployed over here, they're unable to patch these holes. There are no trenches because they were taken over by the Russians already, which is a major success that they were taken over without much fanfare. They were taken over through maneuvers from the flanks by squeezing them out and deploying a large amount of firepower. So now, as a result, the pathway to this village has been opened up, and you're seeing advances that amounts to about 7.5 kilometers westwards, allowing the Russians to enter into the village, although some Russian sources already claim it's been taken over in its entirety by the Russian side. We'll see if there's a geolocation to prove that. I know there was a video actually of a Russian flag being raised in one of the houses over here. I just didn't have time to geolocate it. But that does serve as pretty good evidence that the Russians have been able to seize the village in its entirety. But we'll wait for further confirmation on that because that is actually a news story that has not been circulating that much just yet, but it will within the next couple of hours. So this means that the border region along this sort of outstretched part of Dnipro is increasingly coming under Russian fire, increasingly getting close to falling into Russian hands. It's about 5 kilometers of this chunk of the anti-tank of these trenches that will soon be under direct threats. Areas like Malivka, Sichneve. Obviously, you have the line of trenches on the border, but after that, you have a lot of open areas that will be particularly exposed to these deep Russian attacks. And those attacks can, for instance, reach areas near the Vovcha River, and we'll look at the broader implications of that in future videos. But just know that the Russians over here have a huge chunk of open fields. What is it, like 50 square kilometers, 60, 70 square kilometers of territory running all along this eastern parts of the border, all across southern Donetsk, that is simply untenable for the Ukrainians to hold on to from a defensive standpoint because there are no trenches to be anchored around. And the final villages are right on the border with Dnipro, right on the opposing end of a river. So their backs are behind a river. It's going to be really difficult to defend under those circumstances. So they naturally will have a hard time holding on. And so the Russians will be seizing a large amount of territory due to these recent advances. Also in Vilna Pola, the Russians captured 2.92 square kilometers of territory. We have a video from July 6th of the 15th Mountain Assault Battalion conducting FPV strikes over here. You have a video from the 2nd Self-Propelled Artillery Battalion wherein they shelled trenches south of Vilna Pola, and here you can see the unit itself. So that gives us an idea of the current line of contact over there. In Malinivka, the Russian forces have been able to nearly seize the entire village. They captured 2.4 square kilometers of territory per Ukrainian reporting. And to finish off with Kamyansk, we do have even deeper advances. This advance is not just about leveling off the front line at the Yancher Krak River or whatever remains of it, whatever is now basically a ditch, I would say, due to the low elevation over there. But it's basically dissipated. The water's not there anymore. In any case, though, the Russians have their eyes set upon taking over the entire populated area. So they captured over the past week 2.3 square kilometers of territory, including this northern district. On July 14th, the Omega Wings FPV unit conducted strikes on northern Kamyansk, and the western chunk is also falling into Russian hands. So the push can extend towards Plavny in the future. It could also extend along the E105 highway. And then from there, the threats are palpable to Stepnogorsk and by extension, as we've talked about in earlier videos, Kamyushuvacha. But that's a long-term consideration. First, we need to look at actually securing control over Kamyansk and its environs. And then from there, the next question will be, can the Ukrainians hold on to open fields that are located in the security zone between the front line and the first line of major trenches? Or will they be sort of outflanked from the western direction over here that is just south of Stepnogorsk? That's going to be an important question to ask, and it will give us an idea of Ukraine's defensive rigidity over here. So that's all for today. I know this video is extremely long, but I don't know what I was supposed to do. Like, I had a week's worth of updates to go through, and there were so many. It was a copious amount. I feel bad for missing it, but ultimately, I have one more exam tomorrow, and then I'm free for the summer. I'm gonna try to do daily uploads. I think I'll be able to achieve it, and so I'm very excited for the future of the channel. Actually, I have a lot of things planned that you guys will see sort of unfold throughout the summer, and so obviously like and subscribe if you're still here at this point, so we can sort of actualize that. So thank you all, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.